So I grew up in the church. I'm curious to take a short poll. Raise your hand if you grew up in the church. So most people. And like most of you, the reason I grew up in the church and went to church is because my mother made me, right? Should be celebrated on Mother's Day, for sure. Now, my mother was unique in a way. She was abandoned as a baby and was raised in a foster home by the city of Dallas. And didn't really know any extended family. So when my mom, when we were very little, found a Presbyterian church in Omaha, Nebraska that she wanted to go to, I think it was a very important part of what meant as family to her. Sometimes I think the family we make is just as important as the family we are born in. But I remember as a kid, when I went to church, it wasn't necessarily a lot of fun. The church I grew up in, part of the reason it was appealing to me is this church had the habit that they would serve, and the reason I went, to be quite honest, is donuts, okay? They would serve donuts before worship and after worship, and my mom would bribe me and say if I behaved in worship, that I would be able to get a donut after worship. I learned as a parent, bribery is a very important tool. I can relate to that. I don't ever remember not getting a donut, and I can't imagine I truly behaved that well in worship. Maybe it was my mom's first lessons about the meaning of grace, undeserved donuts. But I remember growing up in the church, there were things I liked about it. I did like the Bible stories. I thought they were fun and interesting and maybe even a little racy for a kid. And I liked the songs and the singing. I liked the potlucks, right? Except for the casseroles with peas in them, right? As you can tell, and probably already know this, the way to my soul is through my stomach, it sounds like. But as I grew up in the church, what I came to be surprised by and what church became more attractive to me is that there were these total strangers, these people, often many of them gray-headed, who as a kid were really interested in me. In fact, they knew my name, though I didn't know theirs. And I remember being startled as a kid that there were these people every Sunday who were glad to see me. Taught my classes, gave me hugs. And when I began to realize, I think, growing up in the church, was that church really is about the people who love you. Not about some grand program, not about some amazing preacher necessarily, but it's about the people who love you. I think that's so true. There are interesting studies in the past decade or so that look at or examine what makes kids feel good about themselves, have strong egos. What makes kids, kind of have a strong sense of themselves and who value themselves. And they're interested in all the different factors. And as you can imagine, many of those factors were related to the family. Stable family, loving parents, those kinds of things were key to a kid growing up into a whole individual. But what they were surprised by is that one factor that really made a difference is that kid had another adult who wasn't their parent or grandparent, but another adult who was interested in them, who taught them and mentored them. I think every one of us could identify, if we think about it, every one of us could identify who that might be in our own lives. A teacher, a coach, a mentor, a Sunday school teacher, a youth group leader, a pastor, a friend of the family, someone who was interested in us and valued us and thought we were important. And the power of that to affect a life is amazing. Now, we don't reflect much on the meaning of church together. We don't really reflect a lot on that question. It's just kind of assumed. We go to church. We don't really reflect on what it means to be the church. And in some ways, there is some confusion about that question if we look at the world around us, culture around us. For some, church is a means of entertainment. For many people in our society, church is full of people judgmental, less than graceful, people who see themselves as moral police and can judge others with righteousness. That's certainly an evident dynamic in our society and culture, that many think of church as if it's filled with people who believe more, who are more certain, more moral, or just good people, right? I think it's so interesting that in the first century, as the church began to arise, that they had to wrestle with that question about what it means to be church. They had to create something. And I'll be honest, I've always been bothered by the words written in 1 Peter when he describes the church. I've always been bothered. He calls it a spiritual house, a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people. I'll be honest, I thought of that as rather grandiose, if you think about it, Seems to imply, and I know I'm uncomfortable with this, seems to imply that if you're going to church, you're better than other folks. Well, the problem with that is spending close to 30 years in ministry, I know that's not true. Myself and others. It's just not empirically true. I've, in 30 years of ministry, seen churches fight over the color of the walls in the women's bathroom. I've seen, in 30 years of ministry, people fight and gossip. And I know that we are not more certain. I know that we are not more moral or moral righteous, because I've been in the church way too long to believe that. So I've struggled with what the writer of 1 Peter is saying here. You are a spiritual household. You are God's chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation. I've struggled with what that means. And what I've liked is that line in here, once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. And what I think is trying to be communicated there, I find this idea startling, that I didn't choose church. Okay? I didn't choose necessarily to be part of the church. The writer is saying God chose us. to be part of the church. That our participation here, our membership in the church, our engagement in the church is not so much our choice as God choosing us to be part of this community. And that, I wrestle with that. That can't be true. I chose this church because I like the people. Or I chose this church because I like the preacher, or I like the music, or I like this. I shopped around to find a church, right? And the writer is almost communicating, no, that's not quite true. God chose you to be here. And God chose you to be here not necessarily because you're going to like the person sitting next to you. Right? I see husbands and wives looking at each other. So. Isn't that true? You're chosen to be here not because everybody agrees with you, right? God just didn't choose Democrats to be part of the church or Republicans. God chose us to be together. Not because we agree, but because God chose us to be together. It's a really radical idea that I struggle to make sense of. But then I realize, you know what? It's so true. Not that we're chosen to be here because we're more holy or more moral or more righteous, but because we are people who walk in darkness and we find this light in each other. That we are people who need mercy so much, we find it in each other. At the discipleship, we had a discipleship retreat yesterday morning, and we were talking a little bit about this question about what does it mean to be the church. And it was interesting. It was very insightful to hear people's response. Some were saying, you know, it's about churches where I can be nurtured and cared for and can learn more about the faith, and churches where I find a community that nurtures me and cares for me. And someone else mentioned that what they found meaningful and powerful is that churches where they can go to practice their faith, right? Where they can go practice on each other. We can practice on each other so that we can practice out in the world. Churches where I can practice forgiving someone if they've hurt me, or I can practice loving someone who's there next to me, walking beside me in this journey, which is the church. But then someone said something interesting. They quoted, and I loved this line, they quoted something they'd heard at another church. Quoted hearing someone talk about this, who said, God can be found in what is between us. Think about that. God is found in what is between us. Which is really an interesting, challenging idea. Because we think often of God as this, old man up in heaven or some substance out there. And in fact, what Jesus witnessed to, what the early church witnessed to, is God is found in what we share. God is love. Not a thing, not necessarily a thing, but a relationship. A relating to each other. It just kind of blew my mind. God is found in what is between us. It's one of the interesting, if one looks back at the history of the early church and some observers of the development and rise of the early church, and there will be people who comment about that rise who aren't necessarily part of the church, but it was beginning to come up in the Roman Empire, these small communities, and they were attempting to try to understand what are these spontaneous communities arising who follow this peasant from Palestine. And it's interesting to hear what they comment and notice about it. And there are a number of comments about, they have beautiful singing. They have beautiful singing in their communities. They also care, one of the things they comment about is they also care in a society that had no social net. They also care for the widows and the orphans. But over and over what they comment on about these early churches, over and over, is they say, see how they love each other. See how they love each other. So I'll tell a quick story about an experience I had. Every summer in my high school career, I would go to what was called Synod Youth Workshop. It was a gathering of high school. It was a summer camp for high school students. It was held at Trinity University in San Antonio. We stayed in dorms. And I remember it was always for those who were going into 10th grade and those who've graduated. So it was a more grown-up kind of summer camp where we shared in small group, and talked about God and each other and cared for each other in those small groups. But I remember going the first time, I was extremely nervous. I was very nervous about going. I wanted to have a good time. This is really the first summer camp I ever went to as a kid. A young person, teenager. And I was very nervous about going, and particularly I knew we got to room with someone else, and so it was very important to me. You were kind of split off from your own group and created a small group with the others in the community, about 350, 400 youth from all over Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas. So I knew who my roommate was going to be vitally important. So I was very nervous as I went into my room at Trinity University. I was very nervous to see who my roommate was. They weren't there, but their luggage was. And on the luggage, it said, the Reverend William Parr. Now, this is back in the 70s when adults would room with, it's a different world, youth would room with adults at times in these conferences. So I knew, God help me, my week was ruined. Even Reverend William Parr, it was on his luggage. I almost opened up the luggage to look through there, see if there was a Bible. I thought, oh my God, all week long, he'll be making me do Bible study in the morning. He'll make me pray all day long. So I knew my week was ruined. And then Reverend William Parr walked into the room, and he looked like a hippie. Hair down to his shoulders, a beard. Said, hey, what's going on? Came up and shook my hand. And I had the funnest week of my life. Taught me how to cheat at backgammon. But part of the reason it was so fun and so much had a profound effect on me was that he was really interested in me and wanted to know me and showed me that we Christians can look like hippies, right? We can be normal, everyday folks who care for each other in profound ways. He showed me, and I'll be honest, I found God in between us. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.